Hello everyone, welcome to another video. In this episode, we're going to talk about Plato's definition of philosophy, how Plato saw philosophy, how he understood it, and how he defined it. These questions are going to be investigated in this very humble and short video to the extent of our ability. Of course, the subject is very deep and very broad. It's impossible to cover in a few minutes, but we just want to provide an introduction to how Plato saw philosophy. As you already know, Plato is considered to be the father of European metaphysics. He is a very, very influential figure in history. He is considered to be one of the most important teachers of mankind. His writings have had incredible, tremendous influence on later philosophy, to the extent that Alfred North Whitehead has said that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. He is that important. Now, Plato, because he occupied himself with lofty and divine thoughts and very subtle ideas, he has been called by many, for example, Muslim philosophers and metaphysicians, the divine Plato, or Aflatun Elahi. Now, in this video, we are not going to give any historical information about Plato because that is accessible and others have had the privilege to do so, but we're going to give a very brief introduction to his philosophy. Now, what is philosophy according to Plato? Let's find out. Before we proceed further, let us give a brief introduction to the word philosophy. What does this mean? Because it is a very ambiguous term. We hear many different definitions of the term philosophy, and sometimes we get confused. There's one definition by Hegel, there's one definition by Aristotle. Many different meaning of philosophy exists in the world. Now, the word philosophy etymologically comes from the word philosophia, which means love for wisdom. It is a Greek word, and according to many scholars, its first usage goes back to Pythagoras, who considered Sophia to be the knowledge of the stellar world. Now, there are, of course, many different definitions by other philosophers as well. For example, Aristotle defined philosophy to be knowledge of the first principles, and Heraclitus defined it as knowledge of change, opposites, and nature of things. Or Socrates, for example, Plato's teacher, was more concerned, I think his understanding of philosophy was about self-knowledge, how to acquire self-knowledge, how to know ourselves. Socrates was not interested too much in the natural world, unlike Plato. For example, if you read his Timaeus, we realize this cosmology and perspective on the nature of things is absent in Socrates. So he was more concerned with self-knowledge. That is why we remember Socrates for his famous dictum, which says, "Know thyself." All these different definitions of philosophy are correct. There is no restrictive definition of the term philosophy. But we must remember one thing, that for the ancients, for Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, all these figures, philosophy was not simple theory. It wasn't something that they learned at universities and then just put it away. But philosophy for the ancients was a way of life, a map of life. Well, of course, this is completely different now in the world that we live in. Philosophy is simply concerned with mind and mental acrobatics and abstract constructions. But for Plato, philosophy was not like that. All these definitions of philosophy, as we said, are correct, but none of them are as intriguing and interesting as Plato's understanding of philosophy. First of all, Plato held philosophy in a very high esteem. He thought that philosophy is the most important thing in the world, in one's life, and anything else is just inferior to philosophy. And he encouraged his students, which is us in a sense, those who read the Platonic writings, he encouraged his students to live a philosophic life. That is, live a life based on reason, on contemplation, on virtues. Platonism is highly practical. It is concerned with man's ultimate end, with the knowledge of the self, with detaching ourselves and freeing ourselves from irrelevant and trivial things of this world to fix our gaze on the ultimate good, the highest good. For example, in his Timaeus, Plato says about the importance of philosophy that the knowledge of the most excellent things begins through the eyes. The distinction of the visible day from the night, the lunations and revolutions of the planets, have produced the knowledge of time and given rise to the investigation of the nature of the whole, whence we have gained philosophy, and a greater good than it, given by God to men, has neither come nor will ever come. So he is explicitly telling us that philosophy is the most important thing in one's life, and if you're going to be a warrior, if one is going to be a king, a ruler, a judge, one has to live a philosophic life. That is why in the Republic he says that kings must be philosophers. And we find the greatest example in Marcus Aurelius, who was at once a king, a leader, and at the same time a very important philosopher who lived a philosophic life. With the Platonic definition of philosophy, we are in a very different realm compared to other philosophers. For example, the German philosopher Hegel, in his History of Philosophy, when it comes to Plato, says, "With Plato, philosophy is confounded with the consciousness of the supersensuous, which with us is termed religious consciousness. Platonic philosophy is thus the consciousness of what is essentially true and right." So Platonism is in a sense a religious philosophy, in a sense that it deals with man's ultimate end, the soul's perfection, the virtues, and judgment, life after death, and all these fundamentally religious questions are answered in the Platonic dialogues and writings. In fact, many people consider Plato to be one of the fathers of the church. For example, Meister Eckhart, the great Christian mystic, in his sermons says, Plato, that great priest. He directly refers to Plato as a priest. Or for example, Francis Cornford, who was a brilliant student of Platonism and Greek philosophy, he says in his book Before and After Socrates, Plato and Aristotle are among the greatest fathers of the Christian church. In spite of certain heretical doctrines, they might have been canonized in the Middle Ages, had they not happened to be born some centuries before the Christian era. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Plato or who have taken a course on Plato, you probably have heard of the allegory of the cave. Now, this is a very famous parable by Plato that is mentioned in the Republic. Plato depicts this allegory in order to illustrate the nature of reality, of the condition of people in this world, and the importance of philosophy and how philosophers have different values than ordinary people. He says that imagine there's this cave in the underground, and there are prisoners in this cave, and these prisoners have been there since the beginning of their life and have no idea about anything else. They're so used to that cave and they just can't imagine anything else. Imagine the condition of men living in a sort of cavernous chamber underground, with an entrance open to the light and a long passage all down the cave. Here they have been from childhood, chained by the leg and also by the neck, so that they cannot move and can see only what is in front of them, because the chains will not let them turn their heads. Plato says that imagine that in this cave, one person decides to leave, just exit the cave. Once they do so, they realize that there is this other world, that it wasn't just a cave. There are other things as well. And as they continue and get further and further away from the cave, they notice the sun and realize that the light that was in the sun, in the cave, was caused by the sun. And they see the brilliancy and intensity of the light outside the cave, and that intensity in a sense hurts their eyes and causes great vexation for them. And once they decide to return to the cave in order to inform their fellow prisoners, the people in the cave laugh at them and say that, "Yeah, this guy just went up in order to go insane and have his eyes ruined." They don't believe that what he says is true. They don't believe his words. He says that there is this other thing, there's this world of forms, there's this sun, and the light in the cave is caused by the sun, but people just don't believe them and think that he's insane or have gone crazy. So Plato says this in order to emphasize that philosophers, once they exit the cave, once they leave the cave, their values change. Once they see the light, the values change. They are no longer men of property and wealth alone, but they're also people who are looking for other pleasures, like intellectual pleasure, and their values completely change. Their goal changes, and their thinking pattern changes. It's a metanoia, a change of mind, a change of heart, an intellectual metamorphosis, so to speak. In the Republic, Plato says that philosophers are those who have an appetite for looking at the truth. So philosophers in the Platonic sense are constantly searching and looking for the truth, for the nature of things. They want to understand reality and also their own selves. They have this insatiable curiosity and thirst for wisdom. So the philosopher must constantly search for new ways of understanding, of learning, and increasing their knowledge. And in Plato's view, philosophers are those who acquire knowledge of the ideal forms or archetypes. Now, any one of you who has taken a course on Plato or who has read him has come across the term ideas or forms. Now, by forms, Plato does not mean the physical form of a book, for example, or a physical form of a pen, whatever. By form, he means that realm of unchanging, everlasting entities that are external to our mind and are situated in the invisible world, and from which everything that we see in this world stems. So anything that we see in this world, whether it be a creature, chair, whatever, it really comes from this immutable archetype, this idea or form which is perfect. There are different modalities of those archetypes, and philosophers must gain knowledge of those ideas, of those forms. Only the man who has a taste for every sort of knowledge and throws himself into acquiring it with insatiable curiosity will deserve to be called a philosopher. Philosophers are those who can apprehend the eternal and unchanging, while those who cannot do so but are lost in the mazes of multiplicity and change are not philosophers. So philosophers are constantly searching for unity. They want to establish the unity of the cosmos within themselves, because the Greek word cosmos, as you know, means order and beauty. And philosophers must look for that patterns of harmonic movements that are found in the universe and try to imitate that as much as they can. And by so doing, they raise their level of consciousness from ordinary human beings to supra levels of reference. And by doing this, they can, in a sense, rise above the other human beings, because they have fixed their gaze upon the highest good, and anything else is just inferior. Other activities and anxieties and worries and fears and hopes and dreams and things like that appear to be very base, inferior, and petty in their eyes. Now, Plato gives us another definition of philosophy which is very, very interesting. He says that philosophers are practitioners of dying. Okay, now wait a second. He's not promoting suicide or anything. What Plato means by practicing death, or that philosophers are practitioners of dying, he means that those who are true philosophers die to their own self, that is, to their own individual, egotistic self that is filled with hopes, fears, and dreams and fantasies of irrational fantasies and desires and passions and ambitions and things like that. Plato says that that has to be conquered. And in order to be a true philosopher, one must die to these factors. The true philosophers are practitioners of dying, and death is less terrible to them than to any other men. And being always very eager to release the soul, the release and separation of the soul from the body is their main care. Now, Plato in general believes that the body, that is the physical body, is a hindrance on our way to knowledge. He says that the body fills us with innumerable desires, fantasies, and distractions, and pleasures and pains, and so on and so forth, which really distract us from reaching the truth. And what he means is that the soul can only acquire knowledge when it is in a state of catharsis, or in a state of separation from the body as far as it is possible. Now, catharsis does not mean in the Platonic sense what it implies in the modern psychological terms, which implies an indulgence in repressed emotions and so forth. What catharsis means in the Platonic context, it means that it is separation of the soul from the body as far as it is possible. Now, he says that the body provides us with innumerable distractions in the pursuit of our necessary sustenance. Besides, the body fills us with loves and desires and fears and all sorts of fancies and a great deal of nonsense. We are in fact convinced that if we are ever to have pure knowledge of anything, we must get rid of the body. It seems to judge from the argument that the wisdom which we desire will be attainable only when we are dead and not in our lifetime. Now, by all of this, Plato does not mean that one should die in order to reach that knowledge. He says that in order to reach that pure knowledge, one must mortify the senses or purify the self and the spirit from irrational desires and base fantasies. Now, this requires in self-discipline, virtue, morality, knowledge, and perseverance. It is a road, it is the way that has to be undertaken in order to reach that destination.